Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hot Topics in Research Ethics webinar series. We're just going to wait a minute or so because people are now being able to join. Okay, it's looking like the numbers people have increased, so we'll get going. I'm Jeremy Sugarman. I'm one of the principal investigators of the Masters of Research Ethics Studies program at the University of Malaya, which is a collaboration between the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute and University of Malaya. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Julia to introduce the Mores program, and then I'll introduce the speaker and we'll begin.
All right, so good morning and afternoon to all. Right, so welcome to this Hot Topic Research Ethics webinar series. As Jeremy said, it is a collaboration between Johns Hopkins University and University of Malaya. So we have run the session in each academic year, and the previous session available at this website, at this link. And we have also arranged another 2 more upcoming sessions. You can see here, this is post-trial responsibility and access to injectable. The speakers are confirmed as well as the date and time. The next one is still to be determined, but we have the speakers and the date and time confirmed. I have the pleasure to introduce to you the Master of Health Research Ethics. By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Julia. I'm the co-investigator from University of Malaya of this research project. So MORES stands for Master of Health Research Ethics, and it is a program developed in collaboration between Faculty of Medicine, University of Malaya, and Berman Institute of Bioethics, Johns Hopkins University, and it is supported by the U.S. National Institute of Health Fogarty International Center. This is a 1-year full-time program. Application deadline is in July or August, but for this year it's on the 31st of August 2023. And session intake is either September, October, but for this year it is in October. MORE aims to produce graduates equipped with the knowledge and skill necessary to engage in the field of health research ethics. And scholarship for applicants from low and middle income Southeast Asian countries may be available. Next, I pass the mic to Jeremy to introduce our speaker for this event today.
Great. Thanks so much, Julia. And it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Effy Vayena. She's at ETH in Zurich. Effy's a colleague and friend and a great speaker, so we're lucky to have her today. You can see she received her PhD in medical history at the University of Minnesota and then did her advanced training at the University of Zurich. She's the founder of the Health Ethics and Policy Lab at ETH. She's an elected member of the Swiss Academy of Medical Sciences. She's the chair of the ELSI, the Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Advisory Group for the Swiss Personalized Health Network. And she's a member of the World Economic Forum's Advisory Board for Global Risk Reports. Effy is amazing because she's originally from Greece, works in Switzerland, and is giving a talk in English. So I'm incredibly jealous about all of those things. Her research interests align with what she's doing today, digitization and ethics and science and technology and the ethical applications for public and personal health. So let me, without further ado, turn it over to Effy. Just remember that what we're gonna try to do is go for about 45 minutes and leave some time for questions and answers. So if you do have questions, type your questions in the Q&A or chat box, and Julia and I will try to moderate that discussion near the end.
Sure.
The session is being recorded, so it's made available to afterwards for the MORE program, but also for you. And we'll give you that link again at the end of the program. So if you want to see this program or old program. So I'll turn it over now to Effy.
Thank you very much, Jeremy and Julia, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you. You have to bear my English accent, which is a mix of the different places I've lived in, but hopefully it will be understandable enough. So I'm going to just take a moment to share my slides here, and please let me know if that works. Can yeah, okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, fantastic. So I will talk today about decentralized clinical trials, and particularly some of the ethical issues that in some work that I've been doing have identified together with colleagues. And I'll explain in the course of this talk why this is a topic worth thinking about and thinking about and researching, and hopefully making some contributions into the future of those decentralized clinical trials. But let's start first with some definitions. What is that we're talking about? Maybe some of you are already familiar with what decentralized clinical trials are, but if you're not, it is, I'm taking this definition here from the Swedish actually regulatory agency, and I'll explain why I chose them, but it is decentralized clinical trials cover actually as a definition, the term covers a lot of different things. Typically it means that the trial participants do not need to go to a clinical trial site, which automatically means that a lot of what's happening during a clinical trial is done remotely, it's done digitally, and it kind of creates, or via other systems that are not connected but that are not located in one center. That's the broad definition of the term. What we often see that it is what's happening is actually hybrid trials, which is a mix of trials that have several components, several elements that are remote or digital, but also some presence at the clinical site. So these are the hybrid trials, but we tend to think about it, whether it's fully decentralized or hybrid, under that umbrella term. I found a nice graph. I haven't made that graph, but I think it kind of shows rather well what's happening. And if you see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here moving, but you can see here the study coordination center. Typically in the analog world, participants will be going here, and the whole the trial will be taking part in this building, this one site. What's happening now, as you see, we have the drugs delivered maybe to this coordination center, but the drugs, or the intervention, and drugs meaning more than just drugs here, the intervention, are actually going out of the clinic, of the site, and they're moving to the patient, and there's internet connection everywhere. There is a connection to probably a local healthcare provider. There's a connection to a local lab, and a collection of data that eventually finds its way back to the study coordination center. But what's happening here is that the locus, let's say, of action moves from the center to closer to the patient. In a fully remote trial, or in a fully decentralized trial, you wouldn't need the local MD and the local lab. But in what we're seeing happening, the trial is moved closer to the community of the patient. So this is, I think, the mix that I described between those different elements. It's not just one thing that's happening. We have different pieces that create this decentralized approach to clinical trials. Now, if you look at the literature, there are various terms. I'm sticking to decentralized because, even if it's not a perfect term, because regulators, and I'll come to the regulators later, have actually adopted that term. But I'm happy to share the slide so you can see this in detail. It's hard to read it, especially on Zoom, but people talk about these trials as remote, or as virtual, or as digital, or as pragmatic, or as siteless. And to some extent, they are a little bit of all of those terms, but we've settled for decentralized, and perhaps that's because, as I showed in the previous graph, we have the different pieces being far away from one single center, the classic clinical trial unit. Now, a lot of people think that decentralized trials are something that happened during COVID, and I'll say why, but in fact, what we know is some form of a decentralized trial has happened earlier. And in fact, not many, but some had started already. Actually, I think the earlier one was 2007, 2010 and 11, etc. But you can see there are not so many. We have here in 2019 a difference. Things are looking much different. I'm sorry, something moved here. And this is an older slide with the projection, but I couldn't find one that shows how many trials have been decentralized in 2022. But I think from my understanding is that this projection is fairly accurate, and that in fact, we will be seeing an increase in decentralized trials as we move forward. Now, what happened during COVID, and I think this is critical, is of course, life came to a standstill, as we all know. I don't have to remind everyone what happened and how we had to live and how we moved our lives online. But as you can imagine, clinical research activities were, some of them had to stop, or like in everything else, they had to be diverted online whenever it was possible. And then, of course, in the midst of doing that, there was a need to coordinate with the study sponsors, with the IRBs or the ethics review committees in order to adapt and adjust. Typically, you have the protocol approved and has to be run the way it is being approved. And here we are not knowing how to reach out to the patients, whether they can come to the site, and all of these things that are happening. And also, again, people had to think about novel ways in which they could fulfill the COVID-19 protocols, which meant, stay away from other people and keep with the regulatory requirements. So you can imagine the challenge that COVID brought not only to everything else, but also to the clinical research enterprise. And during this transition, as we were Zooming for classes or to see our doctors or whatever we did, also in clinical trial research, several challenges came up, because those remote devices or these kinds of approaches were not included in the original study design. Clearly, the study was designed, or those studies at least that were running during this time, or they were about to commence during COVID, they were planned without COVID in mind, without a pandemic in mind. There was no way to have proper validation in place for many of the devices that were collecting digital health data. And we know that very well in education when we started using Zoom and we didn't know what privacy notices we have to give to students or how that was happening. We figured it out quickly, but it took some time. On the other hand, you can imagine that participants in those trials were not familiar with those remote kinds of technologies or assessments. And in many cases, it wasn't clear whether they have actually access to the digital portal. So a lot of things were happening. On the one hand, a tremendous opportunity, and perhaps also the need to not kill the trial, because maybe we have a way to continue it or a way to commence, but also many challenges in order to do it right under the new circumstances and using those fantastic technologies and possibilities that we have that were available. So at the same, as we were kind of getting used to having more trials in this form, there were fewer before, and this was out of necessity and not necessarily out of choice during COVID. We started seeing a lot of commentary about the new normal, and the new normal in general, as you know, we've all read and wrote about the new normal, but there was a conversation and discussion about the new normal in clinical trials. And I've just put here just a couple of papers that I think capture this idea that we are learning during COVID how to do, in this case, clinical cancer research or other research, more translational research more generally. We're learning a lot from this opportunity that we have here, the challenge and the opportunity through telemedicine or other ways of doing consent. And so there was a call out that these kinds of learnings can be used even after COVID, and they may be offered to us a way to do clinical trials in a better way, in a more efficient way, but also in a way that could contribute to social justice. One thing we know about clinical trials is that the classic ones, I will call them analog trials, although they're not fully analog, we still have a lot of digital stuff going on in a classic clinical trial. But still, one of the main problems often we have is the time it takes to recruit people, and also those who participate tend to be patients or participants who have some sort of proximity to that site, to the clinical trial site. So typically, if you live in places that are far away, or if you don't have the means to commute to a clinical trial center, you're probably going to stay out of a trial. And in that sense, we have this cascade of issues. Populations are excluded. From those populations, we don't have data. We don't know how interventions work with them. And a variety of other problems that we hopefully want to correct in the way we do research. And so what happened during COVID, I think, gave an opportunity to rethink and perhaps consolidate some more the possibilities that we have in front of us and use them in terms of increasing the diversity of the populations that we typically include in clinical trials, in reaching populations that are often excluded for a number of reasons, in also having real-time access to participants, something that an analog setting doesn't often, clearly doesn't offer. If you have to come to the trial every 2 weeks, we don't know perhaps what's happening in between. Another benefit that seemed to be present here in these new models is more efficient ways of doing clinical trials, not wasting time on things and paperwork that typically creates obstacles, so increase the timeliness. And some have argued that a trial that is run in that format, either fully decentralized or hybrid, also costs less money. I don't have exact figures, and I'm not sure whether that has been exactly calculated, but I think it's reasonable to imagine that there are going to be perhaps less needs in personnel at a clinical trial site if you don't have people coming in and have to be looked after by the personnel, or if you collect data without intermediaries, but rather directly from the patients to some setting. Again, it's easy to imagine that costs will be reduced and efficiency will probably increase. So what's interesting also in this historical moment of COVID, and I think important for this conversation here, is while clinical trialists and CROs and everybody were thinking how to improve what they're doing and actually get the trials done, the regulators responded. Part of the reason is that, of course, those trialists would have to reach out to the regulators and ask whether, their protocols can proceed the way they were supposed to proceed with those elements in place. And what we saw is, in a very short period of time, several national authorities issued guidelines about how to conduct those decentralized clinical trials. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the reason I also use the term decentralized clinical trials. Again, not because it's maybe the best fit, but because it's what the regulators around the world are using. To my knowledge, several, like in the one in the country I work on in Switzerland, had early on a guidance of how to conduct those trials. The UK, Denmark, Sweden has an entire portal. They even very detailed and actually very useful. And those guidelines included two things: how to do those decentralized trials during COVID, because that was the immediate and urgent question, but also how to do those trials beyond COVID-19, when we are back into some sort of normality, but still we can continue using those technologies. And I should mention also that the two relatively big regulators in this world, the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency, both also issued guidance about decentralized trials. This is important because when regulators give some form of clarity about those types of trials, those trials are more likely actually to be adopted and to be by the sponsors, by CROs, by academic institutions. So this is the kind of setting the scene part, and to maybe for those also who might not be very familiar with what decentralized trials are. But the important thing for today is to look more carefully at whether those types of trials raise ethical issues. We know that there are tremendous opportunities, and I think we've seen it also during COVID, which was a time of stress and urgency. But I think it's also important to look more carefully as to some of the challenges that these trials pose for us, particularly in relation to some of the ethical issues. And in some work that that we did, including also some work in which Jeremy is involved, we tried to cluster those ethical issues in these three categories. In the first, we grouped concerns about patient safety and protection of their rights. In the second, we kind of grouped issues relating to the scientific validity of the trials. And in the third group, we looked at questions of oversight and potential ethical challenges there, given our existing mechanisms and the novelty that we see in these types of trials. So let me go into each of those and discuss them in a little bit more detail. So the first set or group of concerns for us is patient safety and protection of their rights. And here we again have three sets of issues we need to be very attentive to. One is obviously physical safety, something that typically in the clinical trial side can be done in a sort of robust way, given the personnel, the expertise, the way the products interventions are administered. If you imagine now administering products indirect, sort of, by sending drugs to participants or by coordinating with healthcare professionals on the ground, new issues come in. How safely those interventions are handled, how are they stored, how they're disposed, questions about adverse events, how are those monitored at home, and of course, how do we implement here stopping rules? When is the moment where certain things have to stop, a trial has to stop, given this given that things are happening remotely. Now you can see that each of those questions, each of those points rather, it depends a little bit on the type of trial. Is it fully decentralized, so siteless completely, no patient is coming to the site? Is it is it a hybrid trial? So for example, we have a model where the intervention or the drugs are on the site, patients come, but everything else is done remotely. Do we work with a healthcare professional in the community of the patient? So there is a person, an expert, or a trained healthcare professional close to the patient. So all of these things will be different. All of these issues will be different depending on which exactly degree of decentralization we have in the trial. Nevertheless, these are all important questions we have to be very mindful of. The second set of issues within the patient safety and protection of their rights relates to their privacy and data protection. Now, of course, the idea of decentralized trials is that a lot of digital stuff is going on, a lot of data are captured and they are transmitted to the site. And again, in terms of data protection, we do have the principle of data minimization. So we need to collect, or we hope, or we want, and we ask everybody to collect only the data that are absolutely needed and necessary, not everything else. However, here we have an opportunity to capture a lot more than we maybe need. And perhaps sometimes we might not be able to not capture certain things like metadata, just because, not by intention, just because this data can't be captured. So that creates a potential conflict between the data minimization principle and how the data flows into whatever system we have in place to capture those needed data. Also, a very important question here, and this has been also raised by the regulators who have looked into this matter, is what are the digital products that we use? You cannot just say use your phone or use that app, something we didn't during COVID. If there are sensors or any other specific apps that participants have to use, this raises the question of quality, but also the question of informational safety. And so these devices or these digital products that we give people in the context of that decentralized trial, they have to be validated or certified or certainly meet certain standards. Another issue that we see here is, and it's very different from having a closed system in a site, is that we open up a network to participants in various places, perhaps the healthcare professionals closer to the patient himself or herself, the patients themselves. So the opening up a network can also create vulnerabilities and cybersecurity questions that were of less weight, perhaps had less weight in one side rather than in a distributed system that we might have less possibilities to control. And again, in this whole sense of privacy and data protection, if interventions are done at home, or if participants are at home connecting with the trial site or through telemedicine from their homes, we've seen also in the literature concerns about how much privacy people have in their own homes, in their own home environments, when they're interacting with healthcare professionals or with the trial in and of itself. So again, we're saying here, these are not issues that cannot be overcome, but there is a specific set of issues that if you have to design such a trial, we need to be very mindful of. Finally, and again, under the questions of patient safety and protection of their rights, we're thinking also about matters of participant well-being. Now, it's clear that on the one hand, you have the possibility to participate in a trial, even if you live very, very far away from a clinical trial site, but you are also losing the interaction with the study personnel, something that in some cases that is actually beneficial and helpful to people. We also know that, and we know that from other online lives, that we can get into situations where we have reminders and continuous online engagement because, for example, the study may require that we have this engagement in order for the data to be transmitted. We might have accidental surveillance of people's activities just because of the way this data collection is set up. We also have a potential burden of study tasks. Now, if you think again in the efficiency point, of course, and the cost containment you may need less personnel at the clinical site because people are not coming to your site and they do a lot of things on their own. They measure, they take they make various measurements, they show up and, perhaps input data or whatever it is that they're asking to do. But maybe these participants are more burdened at this point as study participants rather than they would have been in the context of an analog trial. And so some also in the literature have also raised the question of risk of exploitation. Are we shifting labor from the site, which was paid labor, to the participants where, that's not paid? It's not, we're not maybe even recognizing that form of that kind of work that's going on. And so is there a way in which these participants should be compensated if we shift labor from the center to this decentralized kind of system? So these are questions that I think we do not have any conclusive answer, but they're questions I think that we're thinking about, again, depending on what type, at what level of decentralization we have in each of those trials. There was one study that was done last year. I think it was published last year. And one of the few studies that did empirical study looking at the experience of decentralized clinical trials and conducted interviews with trial personnel, with patient representatives and other stakeholders. And it struck me one quote that was in the paper, and the reference of the paper is on the bottom of the slide, that the trialist actually said, we said, why do not we try throwing the kitchen sink at it? So let us do remote telehealth monitoring with some virtual devices. We have the patients take their blood pressure remotely, take their weight, their pulse, the glucose meter, and not that we had not used those technologies before, but using them all at once. So you can see that temptation of, if the patients can do all of that stuff and we can get as much out of them as possible, why not doing it? And I think that is a point of concern, because it can have consequences on both the privacy and can have obviously conflicts with data protection, even regulation, but also the more ethical concern about privacy. Perhaps patients or participants sign off a consent that says they're okay doing this, but there is a violation in sense of the principle of data minimization, but also in burdening the patients unnecessarily with all kinds of stuff just because it's possible to collect these kinds of data easily without having lots of people on the clinical side doing it. The other question we have here as well, in terms and relates to people's to participants' autonomy, is that, and I want to highlight a bit, is that of the electronic consent. Now, one of the delights of decentralized clinical trials is that maybe instead of having people sitting down reading long PDF forms and signing them, you can do these things online. And there's a lot of work that's been going on in electronic methods for seeking consent. There are a lot of benefits in doing electronic consent. And again, one can choose not to do electronic consent and do other digital things in a decentralized trial. But I think it's reasonable to expect that e-consent goes really nicely well with a decentralized clinical trial. And so here, the questions that might come up are questions that are not distinct to decentralized trials, but are actually distinct to e-consent. And they relate to the comprehension of information. And even if we claim that a digital form gives us more opportunities to explain things better to people, the notion of voluntariness, whether people skimming through some online thing the same way they skim through terms and conditions in some app that we all, without thinking about click, I agree, whether that is undermining true voluntariness, whether it's possible to verify identity and what would be the necessary requirements to verify identity in this case. Also, some legal complications with the status of an e-signature. Some countries, they're very clear about accepting e-consent and e-signature. Some other countries are not as clear. And in a multi-centric type of trial, this could be a problem. And also what kind of, we don't know so much. There's some studies showing that electronic consent actually is more acceptable by patients and participants, but again, I'm not sure that is how culturally sensitive it is, and it could present an issue. There is one more thing here that I'd like to throw out here also for discussion, and it's based on work that John Wilbanks has done, where he argued that he spoke about this concept of cognitive friction, which is the resistance that we encounter encountered by human intellect when it engages with a complex system of rules that change as the problem permutes. So imagine information about, for example, a trial, that you have to do this or the other, that the purpose is this or the other one. It's a complex system that you have to think about. Now, ideally, and John Wilbanks argues that ideally the aim of a good design is to reduce that cognitive friction, because friction is a problem. Friction turns away your eyes, reduces clicks, it slows the system adoption, and because our brains resist the complex system in front of them. So cognitive friction is what we want in most technology. I'll read how he very nicely put it. Cognitive friction is therefore in most technology design the enemy, primarily because it forces people to think about their actions rather than having their actions seamlessly suggested to them. But what we want in fully informed consent, we want people to think about their actions. We want that cognitive friction to be present so people can have a more robust assessment of whether they really want to do something or not. So I think I'm putting this out there because I think it's important to also juxtapose a little bit the opportunities from the technology and the flow and the efficiency and the beauty of something that is digital and designed nicely, but also perhaps what might undermine in terms of the real action that we want this design to provoke in people's minds. I'm going to leave that set of that group of issues and move on to another one that we called scientific validity. Of course, in the discussion, I'm happy to discuss e-consent and the problems that we have there. Here, I think we identified a few other issues that one needs to think very carefully in these types of trials. Not that this is, again, a distinct issue here. It's just a different articulation of the problem. And I've listed here a few of those questions, including considerations, rather. For example, the choice of study endpoints that relates very much to suitability. Is this decentralized approach, are these methods that we're using here suitable for all kinds of trials or some kinds of trials? Sometimes what happens when we have a new model, we think that it's great for everything. And I think we probably need to be more vigilant about that issue of suitability and what are we choosing to study when we're looking when the method and the methodology and our approach to the trial is this decentralized or a version of a decentralized. I think because that obviously will affect the validity of the science we're getting out of this trial as well. Another important issue is what we call here product certification or product validation. I think I was looking recently, and I think the IEEE seems to be having a project on decentralized trials and harmonization and standardization, because depending on what kinds of products we use, and I'm talking about digital products, not the interventional drugs or other things that we're trying to test, and how they've been validated, I think is really important in the quality in how the trial will run, but also in the quality of the data we're going to collect. And as we know, in the digital space and then anything that in data ethics more broadly, the data quality is extremely important, and it's a very, very difficult and challenging issue. So can we ensure that in a model like this, we have the types of products that contribute to data quality or not? We also have, of course, to look more carefully at inclusion and exclusion criteria. Again, this will the possibility that we can include not more in terms of size, but participants from perhaps more diverse backgrounds or at least more diverse locations, which might correspond to some other form of diversity, is very appealing. But then how does this opportunity affect how we're going to design those inclusion and exclusion criteria? And although the appeal here is that if we are more diverse, we might be able to reduce some of the bias that we know is creeping into most of our research. There's a question of bias being introduced through missing data. And that's again a concern that we typically seem to have when participants collect data themselves, or when they fill in information. We are worried about maybe they're missing data, and what are we going to do about this? There is, if there is no way to, I mean, things could be put in place, but typically here, if you have such a decentralized approach that participants are somewhere far away, and they're the ones that are essentially responsible for the data that comes into the system, that might raise that particular concern. And the other question that I want to talk a little bit more about is that of the digital divide and the risks, the risk of new forms of exclusion. And when we talk about decentralized trials and the digital, and when we talk about the digital more broadly, we think that everybody is online, everybody has devices, and everybody is using those devices for the access to broadband for health also related reasons. And I think this is a very a difficult issue and a misconception that we need to be careful with. Some have called this a form of technological exclusion, because the truth of the matter is that we do not, it's a false assumption to say that everybody is online, even if we're seeing an increase in people's having access to both digital technologies and internet access. But we know that we have the access to either technology devices, or the running costs of those devices are not equitable. We have huge variations. We also have a big difference on how people are motivated to engage with the digital in terms of health, and I'll show you a slide in a moment. And also, we know that there's a huge variation in digital skills and education. And in even in the most simple version of a decentralized trial, it is necessary to have some form of basic understanding of how technology, some sort of basic digital skills. I just wanted to, and apologize for showing only slides from the United States and Europe, but I had better access to those, just to show that it's clear that we have big differences between basic access to a traditional computer or to home broadband in Black and Hispanic adults in the US. And we also know that Americans with lower income have lower levels of technology adoption. Just to say that we know that this is not, when we say everybody's online, everybody is not online, and everybody is certainly not online the same way. This is a graph from Europe to show again that even in the more let's say, homogeneous kind of legal systems and some of the distribution of technology here in Europe, we still have a big difference between how people are connected online, how integrated digital technologies are in people's lives, and how familiar they are with them. And if you look at at this slide, where it shows how people engage with the internet for health-related activities, we see actually a very interesting difference between searching information and actually actively engaging with apps, either to go to the hospital or to visit a doctor. And of course, there's difference between countries. There's difference between these different functions in how we use the digital. The worry I have with this is we take it for granted that decentralized trials might actually increase whom we're reaching, which I think in certain cases it will have, it is true, but we have to be careful and not and avoid this blind spot that maybe makes us actually create different types of exclusion through that. My last point, and I think I'm getting close to, I need to leave some time for discussion, is another set of issues. So as I said, first we're looking at the patient safety and patient rights. We'll look at scientific validity and how this context in which decentralized trials can affect the scientific validity of research. And the last, but very important as well, is this question of oversight. I know all of you that you're working in the ethics of clinical trials and the ethics of research. We have our questions about how well IRBs or ethics review committees work, questions about whether they are equipped to review and to review trials or research in general that is heavily digital or relies on a lot of big data. these questions have been raised in the literature already. And though the question is, what does it mean? What does it change if we have this type of trial? What does it change for the oversight process? And the oversight, of course, happens at different levels. It happens at the investigator and the responsibilities that they have, the investigators' teams, about the kinds of tools that they have to use, the kinds of tests they have to run, but also the kind of, obviously, we have requirements for those designing trials or running trials in relation to GCP, but we have not set much requirements to those in slightly different, I think very relevant here, in that of digital ethics. So are we expecting to see, or should we see some changes in how, in the requirements that we're putting here in terms of the investigators and trial team and trial design team responsibilities? We do have also a set of responsibilities at the institution. Typically, again, institutions bear responsibility for the data safety and the monitoring rules, about the cybersecurity infrastructure. Again, this becomes more complicated. As you can imagine, you have cybersecurity concerns in one side. Now you have cybersecurity concerns where you have a distributed almost system where people are logging in from all over the place. And also, if there are mobile study personnel, again, other types of responsibilities coming in here. So the layers of responsibility, they were there before in the analog trials, but I think they take a different shape here. And finally, the question I think we need also to think about is how IRBs, what are the IRBs mandates and the guidance, IRBs and ethics review committees, depending on where you are and where you operate. But this review mechanism we have, how is this sufficient the way it functions today? What we see in some of those trials, especially those with collecting all this big data, is that some form of monitoring might be necessary. And typically, at least here in our context, IRBs, ethics review committees, they are a type of oversight that's happening in the beginning of the trial, before the trial commences, and a lot less in what happens afterwards. So this notion of monitoring, that some of these projects of decentralized and digital approaches may require some different types of mandates for the ethics review commissions, or perhaps other bodies that are going to emerge if we think more carefully about the needs, the ethical needs that these decentralized trials pose. So I'll close by saying that these models of decentralized clinical trials offer, I think, an opportunity for diversity, for patient centricity, and for efficiency. I think we can make the case for those with some of the caveats that I did try to present. But we do have a number of ethical issues that needs to be addressed around the patient safety and rights, about privacy and data protection of those who are participating, and of course about the kind of oversight that might be better suited for these types of projects. So I'll stop here and to leave some time for discussion. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll stop sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, Effy. That was a whirlwind, covered a lot of issues, and we've generated a lot of questions. So there are about 10 questions. There's some overlap of them, so we may be able to move through them quickly, and if not, maybe answer them afterwards. So great. Robin Mason asked the question, is there any information regarding the quality of data that are collected in a decentralized way in comparison to the traditional way of conducting a trial?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, it depends whom you ask. And I think a lot of, if you look online, there's a lot of CROs and other companies that promote decentralized trials, and they make big claims about how this actually increases quality of the data collection because of the platforms they offer. But I have not seen it makes sense, that's a product they sell, and maybe it's a fantastic product, but I've not seen an independent investigation or comparison of how better the quality is in these kinds of settings. So I'm not sure.
Okay, well, great. So related in some ways is the question of source data verification conducted in a DCT. How does that happen? Sort of related to data quality. That's from Akmal Yusuf.
The source data, which question is that? I'm trying to see.
If you go down to Akmal Yusuf, I'm just trying to cluster questions. I can go through the order. I didn't mean to torture you with answering them
No, that's fine.
Order.
So the source of data verification, I mean, again, there are various solutions that people put forward, technical solutions to verify where they're coming from. I think the most complex is to verify the identity of the participant. And this is where a lot of technical and legal issues are coming in. But what I've seen so far is the variety of technical solutions available to actually verify the source.
Okay, well, great. So there are three questions that sort of cluster around the issue of conducting DCTs in, say, sub-Saharan Africa or low and middle income countries, and how these what are the special considerations? And those are the three questions, starting with Leela Mwaga, Gloria Ross, and Fangkin Chang.
This is a great question, I think, about how this technology can, or this, not technology, this digital approach, because essentially it is a digital approach, can actually offer possibilities to do trials in low and middle income country settings. And here are a couple of thoughts. I think a lot, in my view, this decentralized approach requires some very robust infrastructure. It might not be one building where you have the clinical trial site, but it requires a very robust technical infrastructure. It requires good internet connectivity. It requires all this other digital stuff that I think we need to have if that were to be run well. And so the question is, again, it offers opportunities in cases in the kinds of countries where that type of robust infrastructure is there. But I'm not sure that it offers the same opportunities if you have, a difficulties accessing the internet, or your network is not robust, or all kinds of things that we see. Also costs. I mean, again, we're seeing this from a very Western point of view, where you have a relatively cheap connection packages, and you are unlimited data and whatever, so it doesn't matter how much stuff you upload or unload. I think the situation in many countries is different in relation to how much they have to spend compared to their income to use their phones and their data. So I worry a little bit that while this appears to offer these opportunities, I'm not sure that given those other structural differences, it will give low and middle countries the same opportunity, unless we have the changes we need to have in digital infrastructure. And maybe we're leapfrogging there and it's going to happen faster, but I think that would be a priority in order for them to become useful to low and middle income country settings. The other thing, maybe, Jeremy, another quick point is that the idea that you run a multi-centric trial from another country, that you involve participants in low and middle income countries, I think that can get a little complicated, given also the transfer of data. If you have an intervention that you want to ship out to people, how would that work? So I think it's not a straightforward approach for low and middle income countries, but there are possibilities here offered to us that I think need to be better explored.
Great. So we focus a lot on the digital piece, which is a large part of the DCT space. But there are a couple of questions here about that can go towards more than the digital aspects of decentralization. So, for instance, Fred Lutharth asks, it seems that DCTs are certainly a viable and an innovative alternative to observational studies. However, for interventional trials that require direct clinical interactions or procedures, how does that work? What are your thoughts about flexibilities and complexities of DCT modalities for these trials with interventions?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the suitability question, right? Not every trial is a good idea, I think, for a decentralized trial. And this is the thing that happened. I think during COVID there was quite a bit of enthusiasm because it was an enthusiasm about those trials generated by the necessity. I mean, you had to do it. So and this is a little bit of, when I look around also at CROs and other companies that are promoting them, they're promoting them as, you know, the most important thing that ever happened in the clinical trial world. And I think we need to be, I'm also concerned, like the person who's asking the question, that not all those trials are suitable for that model. That said, I think the beauty maybe of decentralized clinical trials, the hybrid ones, that you can do different pieces. And that is what increases flexibility. Maybe the idea that it's fully remote is, I think, for some trials, absolutely no go. The idea that you have some local context in the community of patients could work, but you could also imagine this sort of other models where some parts of the trial are done on the site and some parts are remote. And I think what we're more likely to see, if we remain reasonable, is we'll see more and more of these hybrid models. So they are the better suited to the question we're asking.
Yeah, and I think we've learned a lot, say, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were going to places to get tested. I think everyone can now put a cotton swab up their nose and do a basic lab test at home, right? So basic specimen collection, delivery of different types of medications and things like that are something that some people may be able to do, and be more convenient for them. So there are a couple of questions on the perspectives of participants. So are there any signals about participants regarding satisfaction? And then also, do decentralized trials have an effect on how much people trust the pharmaceutical industry?
These are two great research questions, so you need to pick them up. Well, there is a study. There was one study was published actually in JAMA that I think indicated that I can't remember exactly. It was published, I think, last year, showing that yes, cancer patients, cancer survivors were more likely to participate in a clinical trial if it were decentralized. So we have some emerging data that people would prefer to be in that model, would be more convenient for them. We also know from other studies that one obstacle to research participation is the burden of time and moving around and going places. So I think the data that are emerging is that people are more likely to participate if the trial was more convenient. And I think the digital here is a little bit more on the convenient side. Whether, again, if you look at the CROs and everybody else who's promoting decentralized clinical trials, they keep saying patient satisfaction is 95%. So it looks like, you know, there is, I'm not sure on what is that based. In terms of trust, that's a hard question to answer. And I think it's a very empirical question. We'll see how the world of clinical trials is moving and what effect this has on patients, and their trust. But I think it's hard to answer like this.
Okay, great. Well, we only have just a few minutes left, and we have a whole bunch of extra questions we're not going to be able to dive into. I'm going to give you the last one that Mike Link asked earlier on. You can see that at the top of the Q&A screen. If there's a way for us to, I'm asking my team if there's a way for us to capture these questions and see if we can get to you. And if not, feel free to email us at the Moray email address, and I'll ask someone to put that in the chat so we can try to get Effy to provide a quick answer to you by email, if that's okay. So, and just before we finish up, we will ask you, as you leave the webinar, there will be a survey link that's going to pop up to tell us what you thought about this and ideas for other sections. So we'll give you the link to the prior presentations as well. I just want to ask you, as you leave, if you could do that survey, that would be fantastic, because we want to be able to provide things that matter to folks, and want to also end by thanking the NIH again for their support. So Effy, if you want to take Mike's question, and then we will show those last slides.
Sure. So the question, I think it will change change slightly by so the question of how single IRB review of decentralized studies will vary from traditional clinical trials. I think we will have to look at slightly different things. I mean, the principles will remain the same, the protection of participants will remain the same, but the how, I think, is going to be will be different from how it was before. For example, should IRBs look at the kinds of digital products that a trialist is promoting, and against what criteria would they say, yes, that's a good sensor, that's not a good sensor, you can use that secure system, that system is secure enough to transmit data or not. I mean, these are different questions that IRBs will have to tackle. Oops, okay.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, I thought I was cut off. Maybe I should. But so I think my view is that the principles remain the same, but the specific questions that IRBs will have to deal with will be different.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So again, the link there is through the Berman. If you can't capture that huge link there, if you go to the Berman Institute of Bioethics website or the Moraes page, you can find the previous sessions, and this one will be posted after the recording is reviewed. Join us for the next upcoming sessions that we mentioned at the beginning. There is that exit survey. We do want your help in doing that. And please join me in thanking Effy for an awesome Hot Topics in Research Ethics webinar. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.